Hello and welcome to Mythcrafts. My name is Dr. Emma Woods. I'm a mythologist, a folklorist and an author, and I run Mythcrafts with my husband Shiva Kumar. So today we're looking at the mythology of weasels in Greco-Roman myth. To be honest, I was surprised at how much mythology is around these little creatures. So much so that I had to split the research up and contain this one to specifically Greco-Roman myths. So why were these cute little critters so important? Well, protecting food and grain stores was a vital element of survival in ancient times. So while ancient Egyptians were busy breeding domesticated cats to keep mice and rats at bay, the ancient Greeks primarily used ferrets, a domesticated variant of the Mustela genus. These ferrets were popularly employed as household pets in ancient Greece, as they were incredibly effective vermin hunters and able to crawl inside the tightest nooks and crannies. And while this may seem like weasel wording, a phrase that means to appear seemingly specific while actually keeping your word choice intentionally vague, in this video I will be using the word weasel to cover the entire genus of the Mustela mammals. So this includes things like polecats, stoats, weasels, ferrets, martens and mink, among others. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, while many English translations of these stories use the word weasel specifically, it actually contextually applies to the domesticated ferret, which predominantly came from polecats. Secondly, Latin versions use the broader term mustela in their translations, and, as the late 4th century writer Servius the grammarian claimed, the etymology of mustela meant mouse spear, which I think is a fantastic visual. And yes, I know that we could have made a much better image with AI, but we do try to keep both AI free and respect Creative Commons guidelines here at Mythcrafts. It also made me wonder if polecat literally just means a long pole-like cat, but I couldn't find anything on that etymology. If you have any ideas, please drop them in our comments below. Anyway, going back to the mouse spear. I believe it's the function of the genus that is important, rather than quibbling over taxonomic differences between similar creations in the relation to the stories here. So we're going to call them weasels. In ancient Greek, the weasel functioned as a household helper, and this placed them within the domesticated feminine world, especially given that protecting kitchen stores from rats and mice was their primary use. However, ferrets never managed to reach the same level of tameness as many of the other creatures that humans domesticated, and so they're eventually replaced by cats, which could perform the same function and were significantly less mischievous and easier to train. As any ferret owner will probably attest, these creatures have retained an element of their wildness that, with their preference for slinking around dark crevices and enthusiasm for bloodthirsty killing, has helped garner their symbolic reputation as wily and deceitful creatures. Aesop's fable, Aphrodite and the Weasel, supports these ideas as it deals with a deceptive female who fails to become completely domesticated. So this is Aphrodite and the Weasel. A weasel once fell in love with a handsome young man, and the blessed goddess Aphrodite, the mother of desire, allowed the weasel to change her shape so that she appeared to be a beautiful woman whom any man would be glad to take as his wife. As soon as the young man laid eyes on her, he also fell in love and wanted to marry her. While the wedding feast was in progress, a mouse ran by. The bride leapt up from her richly decorated couch and began to run after the mouse, thus bringing an end to the wedding. After having played his little joke, Eros took his leave. Nature had proved stronger than love. So that translation was by Laura Gibb. Now, the consensus towards the moral meaning of this fable is that nature is inherent and cannot be changed. However, it is worth noting that the context of this fable is specific to women and relates to their ability to be domesticated as marriage material. It also brings to mind another text, William Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, where a young woman is likened to a small mammal and is systematically physically and mentally tormented by the protagonist until she becomes suitably tamed for marriage. This connection between marriage and the domestication of the weasel becomes even more apparent when we consider that the modern Greek word for weasel also means little bride. If we contextualize it against some of the associated folklore, we see that connection even more. An idiom collected in a compendium of Proverbs by Zenobia states, "The wedding dress does not fit the weasel." Again, suggesting that some women do not have the nature for marriage or domestication. There are also connotations implied within that relate to the negative symbolism of the weasel as deceptive and untrustworthy, and by extension for men to be mindful of deceitful women when choosing their brides and looking for submissive ones. Some Greek folkloric traditions even suggest that brides should leave out offerings for weasels prior to their marriage or run the risk of the jealous creatures tearing their wedding dresses to shreds. So another Greco-Roman myth where the weasel made an appearance was during the birth of Hercules. In the version told by Ovid in Metamorphoses, Hercules' mother Alcmena's pregnancy was the result of yet another fidelity transgression by Jove/Zeus. And Alcmena had caught the vengeful wrath of Jove's wife, Juno/Hera. As Alcmena labored to give birth to Hercules, she called out to the goddess of childbirth Lucina for assistance. Lucina was on Team Juno, though, and she sat outside Alcmena's chamber with her arms and legs crossed, preventing Hercules from being born. Galanthus, one of Alcmena's servants, noticed the goddess's posture and her murmuring of spells, and Galanthus figured out that what was preventing Hercules' birth. She devised a plan and went up to Lucina and proclaimed the birth had taken place. Surprised by this announcement, Lucina jumped up and in doing so uncrossed her arms and legs, allowing Hercules' birth to finally take place. Galanthus laughed at the goddess for falling for her simple ploy, and she paid the price for her hubris. In anger, Lucina changed the servant girl into a weasel. So here's a quote from the A.S. Klein translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, where Alcmena is describing what happened to Galanthus. They say Galanthus laughed at the duped goddess. As she laughed, the heaven-born one, in her anger, caught her by the hair and dragged her down. And, as she tried to lift her body from the ground, she arced her over and changed her arms into forelegs. Her old energy remained, and the hair on her back did not lose her hair's previous colour, but her former shape was changed to that of a weasel. And because her lying mouth helped in childbirth, she gives birth through her mouth, and frequents my house as before. So this tale of Hercules' birth both explains why weasels became a household pet, but it also associates them with childbirth. The story places Galanthus in an interesting dichotomy. On one hand, she was the reason why Hercules was born, but on the other, she defied the actual goddess of childbirth. This contrast of beliefs may explain why weasels seem to symbolize both fertility and infertility, especially within folk magic practices. Weasels were thought to have powerful magical abilities and were associated with Hecate, the goddess of magic and witchcraft. Antonius Liberalis' version of Metamorphoses recounts that after Galanthus' transformation, Hecate took pity upon her, appointing Galanthus as her own sacred servant, and thus explaining why the weasel was one of Hecate's familiars. The naturist Aelin also associates the weasel with Hecate, recounting how she transformed a sorcerer into a weasel in a fit of rage. He states, "I have heard that the land marten was once a human being. It has also reached my hearing that marten was its name then, that it was a dealer in spells and a sorcerer. that it was extremely incontinent, and that it was afflicted with abnormal sexual desires. Nor has it escaped my notice that the anger of the goddess Hecate transformed it into this evil creature. So that's from Aylin, Characteristics of Animals, translated by A.F. Schofield. It's worth noticing that weasel parts were often incorporated into folk magic cures and charms. They were symbols of powerful magic, especially those that dealt with female reproductive issues. While it may seem like the story of Galanthus, weasel brides, and folk magic have little in common, there is a common thread woven through: deception by women. The weasel bride deceived her husband-to-be by transforming into a beautiful woman. Galanthus deceived the goddess of childbirth by uttering lies. And women who practiced magic deal in incantations and spells, and were often seen as dangerous and deceptive. In his work Isis and Osiris, Plutarch tells us that there are still many people who believe and declare that the weasel conceives through its ear and brings forth its young by way of the mouth, and that this is a parallel of the generation of speech. So that translation was Frank Cole Babbitt. And this quote isn't referring to just any type of speech, though. It is specifically relating to the words of Weasley women. These stories warn against the wiles of women, especially the outspoken women whose words are entrenched in deception, deviousness, and enchantment and cannot be tamed. Insidiously, these notions are the ones contained in patriarchal stories which try to instill unjust hierarchies into our society, dividing the sexes by creating a distrust of all women. These stories also add to the oppression of women by devaluing those that will not be housebroken and tamed to serve their male masters. When we consider the plight of the weasel, it was still held in contempt regardless of whether it was a wild weasel or a domesticated ferret who was kitchen-bound and tamed. Despite their household usefulness, domesticated ferrets were still viewed with a degree of disdain, and they were eventually discarded and forgotten once the more controllable and submissive option of cats came along. Perhaps the real lesson here for women should be one of independence. After all, our chances of thriving in the world are infinitely better as a wild weasel than a domesticated and dependent ferret. So thank you for joining us on Mythcrafts. Feel free to let us know your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Until next time, goodbye.